Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. This week's deep dive is basically entitled Protecting Yourself in a Surveillance State. And what got me thinking about this was some recent legislation in the state of Washington in the United States. And for the record, we know that surveillance is expanding all over the world. This is not a uniquely American or Chinese or French or German or Russian or whatever situation. By virtue of technology and the leveraging therefore of technology by governments, we have this problem around the world. But what got me started on this is basically Washington State, because their lawmakers are advancing two bills known as the Driver Privacy Act to regulate the use of flock cameras. Basically, those capture and store license plate information to essentially aid law enforcement. The legislation essentially aims to address concerns about data sharing with out-of-state agencies, such as the federal government, which is basically what the ACLU of Washington was warning about, basically that they could target vulnerable groups within the state by simply having information from these cameras. Now, the bill proposes retention periods for collected data, limited data sharing, and established guidelines for law enforcement's use of the cameras. The House bill also includes additional audit requirements for the equipment as well. Whether it's cameras that catch our cars or cameras that catch our biometrics like our faces, it seems like it's getting harder and harder to maintain privacy in public. And so that's essentially what I want to talk about, because when we are defending ourselves, and I'm going to give you some practical steps here, it's important to start with this simple concept. A surveillance state rarely needs to actually hack you. Instead, it relies on lawful interception, compelled disclosure, bulk metadata collection, commercial data brokers, and correlation across various systems. In other words, looking at all of these different data sets and basically combining that to identify you across multiple systems. So the objective that you or anybody else should have in a surveillance state is to generate less data, make collected data less attributable to you, prevent easy correlation of that data, and maintain plausible normalcy, not just specific or suspicious, behavior. So with all of this said, I wanted to talk about some practical measures that you can take to essentially protect your identity both online and when you're out in public. So the first one that I put together is practice aggressive data minimization. I think this is so unbelievably important. Do not provide real identity details unless legally required. Many surveillance systems rely on voluntary over-disclosure, not necessarily coercion. So avoid adding real birth dates or phone numbers or addresses where optional. There's a lot of websites where I sign up to, and I have specific email addresses for them. I do not give them my actual birth date or any of my actual information. And as I'm recording, let's say the password for this, I'm also recording that fake birth date, so I have a failback. Also, decline to complete profiles if you're getting nudged for that. Like, hey, you haven't filled all of this out. Well, keep ignoring that. Still letting you use the site. There's no reason to give all of the information that you have. Also, use aliases consistently, but also plausibly as well. So I have aliases that I would use online. Like I have an internal Facebook account that manages my public Facebook account. I don't really use that internal account, but it doesn't have my name, doesn't have my location, doesn't have anything or any info on me that could be tracked back to who I am. Right? It's purely there for management, and there it is. And if I were to post things in there, again, not attributable to me, right? So my second point here is segment your digital identity. Do not live essentially as a single unified identity across all systems. Separate email accounts, and you can create Gmail accounts, Proton Mail accounts, which I prefer, and others, but have separate email accounts for government and legal, financial, social media, consumer stuff, and don't cross-link recovery emails or phone numbers, because that limits the correlation, to this. So if your recovery email is like one centralized email, and now all of these separate emails that you've created could potentially be traced back to that original one. Also, number 3, and this is my third point, assume metadata is actually more valuable than your content. And this is something that we don't think about. It's not necessarily about reading your emails or understanding that, but the metadata on your phone can give you location, can give up your location and other things. So it's important to understand that encryption in and of itself protects content, But surveillance essentially focuses on who, when, where, and how often. So basically, who you communicate with, that is metadata. So if I'm calling you, there's metadata that says I called you and we had a conversation for X amount of time, but it's not recording the conversation. Also, movement patterns thanks to GPS, which oftentimes can have behavioral rhythms. Oh, I show up at this one place Tuesday at 9 o'clock every day. Now they can track that through the metadata. So try to figure out and design controls around that pattern reduction. And I think that's the important thing as well. Because remember, it's not necessarily about what you're saying, it's who you're talking to. And this is actually how they track terrorist cells around the world. Point number 4, reduce reliance on phone numbers as an identity. So phone numbers are essentially the cornerstone of state surveillance because we all have phones. So avoid things like SMS-based authentication because obviously that can be recorded by your carrier. Avoid using your real number as an account identifier. You can get VoIP provided services. I mean, Google Voice has them, but there's plenty of VoIP services out there, essentially that you can legally sign up for and use, as opposed to your carrier's assigned phone number and all of that. I have VoIP numbers that I use, as well as secure messaging apps, all those kinds of things like Signal. So you can basically start to really harden yourself down. Point number 5. Opt out of commercial data aggregation wherever you can, right? So many governments will actually just buy the data instead of collecting it. I've done segments on this where they're just going to the data brokers to get data on you. So opt out of data brokers as much as you can. Disable any kind of ad personalization and location sharing. I've intentionally gone through my Google, Facebook, etc., disabling all of those different kinds of things. Also, avoid loyalty programs and smart services that going to track your that will track your behavior longitudinally. So if you go to the supermarket and you punch in a phone number, they start to understand what you're buying, and by virtue of that, you can run into problems. Target actually had an issue with this when they sent, I think it was like a 15 or 16-year-old girl, advertisements for pregnancy stuff. And her father got really mad and walked into Target, only to find out that that's what his daughter had been buying because she was pregnant and didn't tell anybody. But Target saw it, their algorithms understood it, and they started sending her those advertisements. This is how precise these things can be. It's the same with credit cards as well, although those are harder to get around because everything you buy, Visa, Amex, whoever you're using is going to understand that. Point number 6, lock down location data aggressively. This is something that I really strive to do as well. But location history is oftentimes retained indefinitely, and it can be shared rather broadly as well. So disable any operating system level location history, whether you're Android, iPhone, Windows, Mac, whatever, right? Grant location only while using. That's what I do. So when my Google Maps opens up on my phone or Waze or whatever, it actually says, hey, I have to turn on GPS, and I say only while using the app, and as soon as it closes and it opens it again, it prompts me again. So it's not constantly feeding back. And I went through all of my apps to ensure that anyone that wanted that permission didn't have it without my express consent. Also, revoke access from apps that don't really require it. I've gone through all of my apps and disabled all of the permissions, and most of them work just fine. Why does the calculator need access to the camera? Those kinds of things, right? And so assume that your location is then tied to your identity, because that's what surveillance states are going to do. Point number 7, treat biometrics as a convenience, but not as privacy. And I think this is super important because biometrics are oftentimes compellable under law. In other words, they can basically put your thumb on the sensor or put your face in front of the camera, to unlock your phone. So only use biometrics with a strong fallback, like an aggressive password and all of that. If you are crossing borders or you're moving into sensitive environments, turn your devices off. I know there's a tendency, especially when there's something going on situationally where everybody's got their phones out, et cetera, and recording, and that's well and good. But then maybe take a second offline device to record, but your actual phone, turn it off. It basically becomes what's called BFU, or before first unlock, and it's much harder to crack and turn on. And if I'm using biometrics, for example, I am required to punch in my password, so I can't be compelled if my phone is off, because at first boot, it requires a password, not a biometric. And also understand that face and fingerprint, all of that does not equal consent-resistant authentication, right? They can put your finger on the phone or put the phone to your face. And if it's off, You have to type in a password. Best of luck. It's much harder to crack that way. Point number 8, reduce sensor exhaust. And I think this is an important one as well. I've been compiling these notes for some time, for the last week or so, but I think this is an important one because phones continuously basically send data beyond what we all realize, right? So disable Bluetooth, disable Wi-Fi scanning if you're not using it. Mine are perpetually off. And the only time I have Bluetooth on is if I'm putting in earbuds to listen to something temporarily, and my Wi-Fi is almost always off unless, let's say, I'm at home or an environment where I know it's secure, but they're always off. Always also avoid voice assistants as well. I know we all love our Siris or whatever, but the point is that they have to listen constantly to essentially hear their trigger word, right? I've done segments on this with Amazon Echoes where I'm like Schmexa, Blexa, blah blah blah, and as soon as I say the trigger word, it fires up. It has to hear all of that to discern one from the other. All of this can be recorded on you. Also limit background app refreshing as well, because that sends out needless data, and all of that. So this is a huge one as well. Point number 9, control lock screen leakage. This is something that I practice constantly as well, because surveillance oftentimes begins with opportunistic access, meaning they just come across it. They don't have to break into anything. So if you disable lock screen notifications for sensitive apps, then nobody can just glance at your screen and see an incoming text from somebody that, is possibly under surveillance as well. Hide message previews. This is so unbelievably important as well. And require an unlock for voice assistance and quick actions if that is essentially, if you're going to be using them. If you're going to be using a voice assistant, I do not personally have those. I disable them, and I think that's to my best interest because my phones possibly are listening less. At least I hope they are. Number 10, be intentional about your app ecosystems. Now, apps act kind of as third-party intelligence collectors because basically the Googles and Facebooks of the world and Amazons of the world are integrating what are called SDKs or software development kits that can scrape a lot of your data. So avoid apps that monetize behavioral data, prefer open, minimal function applications. If you look at my phone, like I have the least amount of apps that I can have. And if the operating system updates and it installs a whole bunch of superfluous apps and games, I uninstall all of them. I only have exactly what I need to just basically run my life. And I'm also checking on it periodically to make sure that I don't have stuff hanging out there that I'm not using. And remove unused apps, right? They're still going to collect metadata if they're live and functioning because they're plugged into the operating system and they'll fire up. Now let's focus on computers for a second, because point number 11 is for them. Assume that the browser that you're using is essentially a surveillance surface. Most surveillance occurs through browsers, not actual malware. So use basically strong built-in tracking protections, minimize extensions, like don't install extensions. I use, for example, Brave, the web browser. I also have a browser called LibreWolf. Brave is kind of a clone of Chrome. It uses Chromium. LibreWolf is a clone of Mozilla, but it strips out a lot of the trackers. It strips out all of those things. I don't install extensions at all. And also you can separate browsers or profiles by activity type, to ensure that some stuff is more secure than others. But by doing that, it also reduces cross-context correlation, which is something that is super important. That's why I have multiple browsers on my computers. But when I am going and looking at stuff that would be considered sensitive, whether it's for clients or something else, I'm either in Brave or I'm in LibreWolf, and those tend to be better than just the default Chrome, which tracks the bejesus out of you, and even Mozilla, which is actually a lot better than Chrome in terms of tracking, but nowhere near its stripped-down companion LibreWolf is. Point number 12, encrypt everything. But we also have to understand the limits here. Disk encryption, for the record, protects against loss and casual seizure, but not necessarily compelled access. And that's something that I talk about all the time. So if I were to, let's say, have my laptop stolen while it's in my bag, from an airport or something, I'm having a bad day, but because it's fully encrypted, nobody's going to access the data. Full disk encryption should be mandatory. It natively comes with iPhone and Android. Windows has BitLocker. Apple has its own encryption standards that you can enable and you can enforce. Use strong credentials. Your password shouldn't be password or a 4-digit PIN. Those are easy to crack. Most of my passwords on including my mobile phones, are 14, 15 characters long, or much longer than that, depending on what it is. And it's from 4 character sets: uppercase, lowercase letters, numbers, and special characters. Think like dash, exclamation point, like all that kind of stuff as well. It'd be very hard to crack my phone if it was turned off, and the only thing you had to fight against was this really long password that was rather complex. On top of it, power off devices when they're not in use. This goes for computers as well, because if they're powered off, the encryption is running on the disk, basically, and it's hard to access. Encryption, for the record, is about control over timing. It's not an absolute denial, but it protects you. So if my phone is off and it's taken, by the surveillance state, for example, they're not getting into this thing without an awful lot of work. So point number 13. Reduce long-term data retention, because surveillance thrives on historical records. Delete old emails, old messages, documents, all of that. Avoid indefinite cloud storage for sensitive material. Periodically review and purge local files on your computer, even your phone. Remember, less history equals less analysis going back retrospectively on you. So that's an important one as well. Point 14. Avoid single sign-on convenience. Now, this is a double-edged sword, because in business, single sign-on is one of those things that really can protect the user when you have good identity access management. But in personal life, as you are using a single sign-on provided by like Facebook generically, or those are the ones I'm talking about, because an SSO does centralize identity, so it simplifies correlation. If you're using your Facebook credentials or Google credentials to log into every site in your personal life, now all you have to do is go to Facebook and Google to see where you're logging in and what that SSO looks like. So get separate credentials for high sensitivity accounts. I do the exact same thing. I don't use personal SSOs. Business, again, is different, but on my personal side, I don't do this. Also, avoid linking accounts for convenience, right? Don't use that Facebook SSO. Treat account linking essentially as disclosure for everything, because if I can get into my Google account and that gets me into everything, they can do the same thing as well. And so with that, let's talk about physical and behavioral measures, because I've talked about phones, online life, data, all of this. But when we're out in the world, we have these issues too, right? Cameras are everywhere, etc. So point number 15 I have here is normalize privacy-preserving behavior. Standing out in this case is counterproductive. I can understand people want to get out there, you want to protest, you want to do whatever it is, wherever you are in the world, but understand that that also paints a target on your back. Balance that risk. Avoid extreme or erratic behavior. Blend in basically to the expected patterns that you're seeing around you. In other words, don't stick out, right? Consistency is safer than secrecy when we're talking about physical security here. Surveillance systems tend to flag anomalies. And we've all seen the images, we've all seen the video cameras where that one dude is going absolutely off the rails in something and everybody else is just kind of by the wayside, right? You want to be by the wayside in a situation like this for the most part. Point number 16, treat travel as a data event. Now, this is, I think, so unbelievably important. I travel like crazy internationally as well. But borders and like transit hubs, they're surveillance checkpoints. That's essentially what they are. If I'm exiting a plane to stay within an international airport to get to another plane to go further into the country or even to another country, I'm going through like a choke point and a checkpoint to to basically be surveilled. Carry minimal devices when possible. As I'm traveling and I'm exiting and I'm going through customs, or TSA or whatever it is, if I'm in the United States, I have all my devices as off. They're going through basically the scanners and testers and all of that, and I'm only carrying what I need. So power off your devices in transit as well. Also, don't use travel networks, don't use the airport Wi-Fi and all of that. And for whatever reason, if you have no choice but to, don't log into sensitive accounts. That's not the time to check your bank or personal email, all those kinds of things, unless you absolutely have to, but I just wouldn't do it. And point number 17, which is actually my last point, control physical documents and artifacts. Paper still matters here, right? So secure mail, actual snail mail and deliveries. Shred documents thoroughly. I have basically a cross-cut shredder that turns everything into little bits of confetti, that would be very hard to reproduce. Don't ID photocopy, right? Don't photocopy your IDs. Avoid unnecessary photocopying of IDs because, again, it could be just as good, as your regular ID. I mean, physical records are oftentimes digitized later if they are taken. So it's an important one to understand. And finally, I think this is not necessarily a point, but I think we have to remember this inevitable fact. You cannot be invisible to a surveillance state without withdrawing from modern life. And we are not turning into the Amish. We're not going, into caves like hermits. The realistic goal of everything that I've just said is essentially to reduce the amount of data that you've generated and limit long-term retention of anything that you have because, again, they can't retrospectively go back at you, and prevent easy correlation across systems, and also to maintain lawful and ordinary behavior in it. Don't stick out. Now, in the end, privacy in a surveillance environment, it's about friction, it's about ambiguity, it's about restraint. It's not paranoia, it's not absolutism here. We have to have a certain amount of flexibility, but survivability is the key. And that's one of those things that a lot of people don't understand. And that is fine. And for those people that want to go out and you want to protest and all of that, obviously, wherever you are going out and protesting and all of that, be safe. Just be safe, be secure to the best of your ability, minimize your footprint as best you can with technology. And if you are going to go record things, then basically get a burner phone and record it and stream it that way. But don't use your regular phone. Have that turned off when you're out there. So those are basically my points for surviving in a surveillance state and protecting yourself in a surveillance state. And I'd love to hear feedback on this, but it's a video and a podcast and a radio segment that, quite frankly, just needed to be done. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, 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 I'm going to say private, informed, and secure. Take care.